Welcome, gentle reader, to this episode of Everything is Everything. That is the great Amit Varma, in case you forgot his name. And my name is Ajay Shah. And today we're here to talk about manufacturing. Now, the idea for this episode came from episode 419 of The Seen and the Unseen. This is a lovely episode. I was saying to Amit, it's one of the best episodes of The Seen and the Unseen that I have experienced. It is a conversation by him with Naren Shenoy and Sudhir Sarnobat. It's 4.5 hours long, and it takes you inside the mind of what is going on in the world of business in India, about the difficulties faced by business in India. It is basically expensive, difficult field work that researchers would have to do to go find people like this who are so deeply knowledgeable at the ground level and understand what is going wrong with them. So I loved the episode, and then Amit and I immediately planned that, okay, with this as a jumping off point, what cool things can we do? So we have planned 2 episodes. Okay, both of them center around manufacturing. Let me just sell this to you for 1 minute, and then I'll show you the sense of the 2 episodes. There is agriculture, there is manufacturing, and there is services. And there is a traditional belief that the essence of economic growth is to crack manufacturing. We all dream about vast factories with 20,000, 50,000 workers, all sitting obediently on an assembly line, okay, straight out of Charlie Chaplin, modern times. And these people get stable jobs, and it creates a transformation of productivity in the economy. And that's a story that's running in the heads of most people when you say economic development. So manufacturing is very interesting and very fascinating. In the episode today, we're going to start at a bleak summary that manufacturing in India is not working well. Okay, this is the same as what Naren Shenoy and Sudhir Sarnobat are telling us, that there are serious problems in this field. And in this episode, we're going to talk about a sense of how manufacturing is different from services, a history about the way the Indian state came up with one mistake after another that has interfered with the possibility of success of manufacturing in India. Then we're going to focus on 12 problems that bedevil manufacturing today. And that's just a good summary of what is going wrong. Why is India failing on manufacturing? I think all of us need to put up this checklist in our bathroom and, worship every day that we're going to solve these problems. And finally, we'll do a little bit of union versus state. A lot can and is being done at the state level. Every state can and should build an economic growth strategy to go after its subset of these difficulties. That's the episode today. And then next week, we're going to go after a bigger question in development economics, which is, can there be a growth strategy for a country where manufacturing is not of essence? And we're going to question a lot of the conventional thinking on the criticality of manufacturing. So this is our plan for 2 episodes, this one and next week. Amit?
I'm already super excited. I'm also glad you liked that episode. Sometimes this happens. A singer-songwriter who has barely learned to play the guitar will sit with the instrument and they will write a song, right? But is it a good song? In the moment, they will feel ki haan, acha hi hai, sounds good to me, but I don't really know. There is a lot of self-doubt. Now imagine if that person takes that song to Bob Dylan and plays it for Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan says, "Wah, kya baat hai? This is such a great song." So for me to do an episode on manufacturing and for you, Ajay Shah, to say that it's a good episode is exactly the same thing, right? You are the kind of economist who actually has lists in his bathroom about how to make Indian manufacturing better.
Don't you?
So, I don't want to tell you what I have in my bathroom. Actually, I don't have any lists, so there's nothing embarrassing there. There are shower gels and shampoos, but let's not go there again. But yeah, we're going to have fun, So I got to tell you, just before we started recording, we were kind of looking at the pointers, ki industrial policy and labor laws and this and that. And Ajay suddenly said, I'm having so much fun. I can't imagine having so much fun. And I'm like, bhai, you are having fun? I'm trying to memorize phrases. You are having fun? No, I'm also having fun. Ajay, a central premise of why we are doing this episode and why Naren and Sudhir did that episode with me is that Indian manufacturing today is broken. But gentle readers may want to know, what do you mean broken? Prove it. Show, give me the numbers.
So I'm going to show you two qualitative claims. The numbers match up, but they're not interesting. And then I'm going to show you some hard numbers. The qualitative claim is that when you get high GDP growth, the share of manufacturing in GDP really should go up by a lot. That just hasn't happened in India. We're stuck. We're just perennially in the range from 15 to 20% for the last 30 years. It's not moving, and 20% of GDP ain't much. Okay. Similarly, the claim is that when economic growth happens, the share of manufacturing and employment should go up. No, it's not happening. There's no meaningful presence of manufacturing in the overall employment, and it's not going up. Okay, so these are two ways in which it's broke. But the most stark way in which it's broke, we see in the exports data. Let me read from this table. In this table, I'm showing the exports of goods and services over a full year expressed in billion USD. Note nominal USD, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So let's look at services. Services exports grew over 10 years from $151 billion to $341 billion. Okay, nice hefty 126% gains in a decade. Okay, now you're talking like you get 126% in a decade, and it is real genuine growth. Also in absolute numbers, $341 billion of services exports is nothing to sneeze at.
That happened to my weight, but continue.
Goods, on the other hand, grew from $319 billion to $442 billion, which is 38% growth over a decade. Okay, 38% growth over a decade in nominal dollars. Now, actually, the United States did not live up to its vows and deliver a 2% inflation target in this decade. Inflation was actually like almost at 3%. So if you think 3% inflation over a 10-year period, so this is the nominal dollar is not comparable over this time period. And then you feel that the Indian manufacturing exports growth over this 10-year period is basically like nothing. It works out to like a 0.5% real growth per year, which is just nothing. There is a serious crisis with manufacturing in India. So I've showed three different facts. Manufacturing exports growth over the last 10 years of about 0.5% per year compounded expressed in real USD, which is abysmal, and no real growth or absolute numbers on manufacturing employment, and no real gains on the share of manufacturing in GDP. These are the three ways in which we claim that manufacturing in India is broken, and it behoves all of us to think about what is wrong and what should be done about it.
Give me a sense of what these figures actually mean. Like when you talk about manufacturing being only about 20% of GDP, what is it in other countries? What was it, say, in South Korea, Taiwan, when they were having their boom years, 60s, 70s, 80s? Like what is a healthy figure? Where would we like to be? And so I get a sense of what's going on here.
So it is true that by the time you get to the advanced economies, like the OECD countries, then again manufacturing as a share of GDP declines. We have seen a middle zone where it goes up to 40-50% of GDP. So in some dream world it ought to be 40-50% of GDP. Instead we are stuck at 20.
So Ajay, the good news for India in the last 30-40 years is the way services has taken off, and the bad news, as you point out, is that manufacturing hasn't quite done that despite the reforms of 91. So give me a sense of why is there such a stark difference between manufacturing and services?
So all of us should be thinking about what are the ways in which a manufacturing problem is different from a services problem. And then that is of essence in diagnosing that are we creating an environment that is conducive to the success. Okay, so the first problem I want to put up is that factories are legible. Okay, and I use the word legibility in the sense of James C. Scott and seeing like a state. Factories are bulky. You can see factories. Every local gunda can see a factory. The state can see a factory. So the moment a factory comes up, a whole rapacious non-rule of law and Indian government policies goes after the factory. Whereas with services, we are able to hide away these things to a greater extent. There'll be some innocuous looking office building, and there'll be a floor of that building where some very powerful services work will be done, but it doesn't readily attract that much attention. Okay, so this is a very weird problem, and you agree this is a uniquely Indian problem, that people in India are not safe. And once you create a highly visible structure, then a variety of people want to extort. Some local people will come and say, we're doing a puja, you have to fund us. Local people will come and say, build a school for us. Local gundas will extort that if the trucks have to go in and out of your factory, then you owe me some hafta. Okay, and the state, every imaginable inspector shows up and will extort money from factories. So the first idea is that factories are sitting ducks. All the problems of extortion and expropriation by private persons and by state personnel afflict factories more. So services is just better because it's a little more hidden, it's a little genteel, it happens in nice buildings, and there are many different firms in the building. There's not one clear concentrated owner. So the word state legibility has to be imported here, that the problem with factories is that they are visible to the state. So this is the first thing where manufacturing differs from services. Okay, the second place where things have gone wrong in India and where again manufacturing differs from services is manufacturing is all about highly specialized factories that transport their intermediate raw materials to each other. It's a global value chain. The technical term GVC is used. It's a global value chain, but in terms of saving costs of logistics, it also matters that it's a local value chain. So it is very convenient if I build something and within 10 kilometers, I get it out to you. One of the most magical things I've seen is in the Baroda region. There's an entire chemical industry complex where there are multiple private factories who endlessly run a pipe to each other. So the output of one factory runs on a pipe to the next factory, and they put a meter on that. So how much goods are going from me to you, and then I'll invoice you. But there is no friction at all because it's flowing on pipes. Okay? These are supremely efficient arrangements when you can be physically nearby and you can move goods to each other, and that creates externalities. In the words of the great economist Albert Hirschman, he called this linkages. He said what is great about manufacturing is all these linkages. Well, what has happened in India is, imagine if somehow you manage to think of 20 buddies who are going to build 20 factories where they'll all buy and sell to each other. And they all decide that we're going to be within 10 kilometers of each other in the region of Nashik. Okay, the trouble is operating in India is messy. Something or the other trips up 5 out of the 10. Okay, so there will be a different mode of failure for each of them. The Indian governance environment is messy. But because some of those 10 don't come up, there are several project fails, factory fails, company fails, something or the other goes wrong. Then the linkages don't quite come together. So the interconnections, what should have been amazing network effects of many manufacturing firms working together, actually turns into a disability in India because something or the other goes wrong. In contrast, in the world of services, we interconnect the factories, we interconnect services production sites on fiber optic cables. So you just don't care that you get all the linkages, and further the linkages are all over the world. You just don't care where the facilities are physically located. You put a data center in Greenland, you put a customer in Japan, you do some processing in India, you do some other processing in Mozambique. We just don't care. We move electrons all over the world. So the complexity of getting a tight network of many firms working with each other, being interlinked to each other, getting the network effects is particularly difficult in the Indian environment where something or the other goes wrong. So just think of it as complexity doesn't work well in India because there are too many buggy components in our Indian landscape. One fellow will go down with a labor law, one fellow will go down with some banks and creditors, one fellow will have a problem with a local politician, something or the other will go wrong. And then those fails interfere with the rich network effects of many factories that buy and sell from each other. Okay, the third problem is capital. Manufacturing is much more capital intensive than services. What do you do for services? You rent a floor of a building, you rent a building, okay, and you're up and running. You don't really need to put a lot of capital. By now, the cost of computers and the telecom switches and all that has gone to zero. So you just need a shiny office with clean lighting and air conditioning, and you're up and running. So the capital cost is really low, and modern services firms don't even bother holding that capital stock, they rent. Okay, so you really don't need much capital in a services business. And in an export oriented services business, you get paid rapidly. There's no great working capital problem. There may be a 1 month, 2 month working capital cycle. You pay your workers today, you get paid next month or the next month. That's all there is. There's no complexity of capital in the services business. That's absolutely not the case for manufacturing. The first is the land requirement is higher. It's capital stock. Then there is all the machinery. You have to buy quite a bit of complex machinery in the manufacturing game. See, again, in services, no sensible person will ever buy equipment. You'll rent in the cloud, you'll rent in Germany. There is no case for holding equipment in India. There is no case for paying air conditioning costs in India. You'll just rent in the cloud, and it is so cheap, it is so efficient. In manufacturing, you have to buy complex high-tech equipment, and that builds up the capital cost of first putting up the factory, and then you get to working capital problems, that you will deliver some goods, you have to buy some raw materials, you get a more complex working capital cycle. Now here in India, we have a weird problem around working capital. Big companies routinely misbehave with small companies. It's a horrible way of behaving, but that's just the way India has become. I consider it very inefficient for big companies. If I was a big company, I would promptly pay small companies, because then I would get better procurement. I'd get my goods produced more effectively by the small company, because it is my competitive edge to source cheaper capital. Okay, so if I'm a 5,000 crore company with listed equity and with some bond issuance, I'm getting very low cost of capital. So in fact, I should turn it into my advantage. But big companies in India are so short-sighted, they always squeeze small companies and they extract working capital out of small companies, which makes no sense at all. And the Indian financial system does not work well. It does not effectively deliver working capital to these companies. So on both counts, you want to buy land, you want to buy machinery, and you need working capital. Overall, there is a lot of working capital that is required in manufacturing, the likes of which is not a problem in services. So that was problem number 3. Okay. The fourth problem is electricity. Okay, this sounds trite. Like, what's a big deal, electricity? My God, the Indian electricity sector is a mess. Okay, so we are doing this recording in rural Maharashtra, a scant 70 kilometers from Bombay. And it's astonishing how 10 times a day the MSCB power trips. Like, what is this nonsense? And now you think from the viewpoint of a manufacturing company, that's a no-go. Like, you cannot have a factory where your equipment trips 5-10 times a day. So everybody has to get a bloody generator. A, that bulks up your capital cost, and B, it's horrendously expensive. Burning diesel and running your factory is horrendously expensive. Okay, suppose not. To the extent I am able to buy electricity from the grid, I am overcharged for electricity in the grid, because the Indian state runs a welfare system where the commercial and industrial users, the so-called C&I, the C&I are overcharged for electricity, and this is used to do subsidies for domestic and for agriculture and for all the thieves. So there are people stealing electricity, there are people in agriculture who get free or nearly free electricity, there are domestic people who get 200 units free, 500 units free. All this stuff is loaded on the backs of the C&I. So electricity is a critical raw material for manufacturing. There cannot be a factory without excellent electricity. And India is a fail. Like, Gujarat works reasonably well, all other states work reasonably badly, and this is a barrier to getting manufacturing done. Ultimately, it's a cost. Hiding inside this electricity problem is a renewables problem. If you export into the world, one by one, the countries of the world are demanding a border carbon tax, where either you buy renewables at home or you pay a tax at the border of Europe, starting next year at the border of the UK. One by one, the countries of the world are introducing these taxes. And for a buyer of electricity in India, it's a double whammy. First, you pay for some of the most expensive and low efficiency electricity of the world, the most intermittent and expensive electricity of the world. And then a double whammy is you pay a carbon tax at the border there because the electricity here is made in a carbon intensive way. This is just a really bad arrangement for manufacturing. Number 5, we get to infrastructure. Manufacturing is intensive on moving goods around, which is not a problem for the services world, where electrons fly on fiber optic cables and no atoms need to be moved. Number 6 is the time horizons. A typical manufacturing project, a factory, is really a project of 5 years, 7 years. You NPV over 5 years, 7 years, and it all becomes square. The margins in manufacturing are just not big enough to make it have a shorter payback period than 5 years and 7 years. So you really need to be stable and dig in and play for the long term, get low cost of capital, and have your plans work out correctly on a 5-7 year horizon for this to work. And it's an unstable world, it's an unstable environment. And 5 to 7 years is scary for many an Indian entrepreneur. In contrast, the basic business viability of services production in India is so great that you get 1 year, 2 year payback periods. That if you can land the global customer and you build the delivery system, it pays back rapidly. So you don't really need too much long-term thinking. You don't need to figure out the stability of your arrangements over a long time period because it's a short problem. So manufacturing is a more long-term problem. Okay, finally I come to the problem of the cathedral of complexity. Okay, we already talked about linkages. Okay, manufacturing is complicated and there'll be many pieces that are done by highly specialized firms. That's the way it should be. If you try to build one big campus where you will do 20 things, you will end up doing them inefficiently. Specialization is the key. Adam Smith's example about pins, right? Pins. Adam Smith's example about pins is the story that you become specialized, you do one thing well. And so each factory does one thing well. And to some extent, this is a global value chain, but always in India, there'll be many pieces. So imagine you'll give me a contract to make something. I will farm out 6 pieces to 6 other companies, and then their sub-assemblies will come back to me, and then I'll put it together and I'll sell it to you. And I have a contract on you that I have to deliver something successfully to you. So let's say you're a global buyer, you give me one contract that I have to build something. And then I am orchestrating many pieces in India. This choreography is genuinely hard. The global manufacturing business is so efficient, is so tight, it's not funny. The world runs just-in-time inventories. So on the precise day, your goods have to show up. You can't be 1 day late, you can't be 2 days late. The precise quantities and the precise deadlines have to happen. Now here in India, when you are pushing against a variety of vendors that work for me, those vendors are all a little bit sloppy. Okay? So it may even be that I will do a terrific job of fighting a Herculean battle to try to get stuff to you on time. You're a global player. I understand the discipline and the mores of working for a global buyer. But I'm working in a messy Indian environment, and one or the other of my suppliers will tend to fail. Okay. Now let's pause to think of what it means by fail. It means a contract violation. There was a contract. You were supposed to give me 5,000 ball bearings today. You did not give me 5,000 ball bearings today. Okay, and my entire assembly line got frozen because your ball bearings did not come to me. Okay, this is a contract violation. This is the criticality of the basic mechanisms of dispute resolution in the country, that you should be able to go to court and enforce the contract. It is very simple that there was a contract, you were supposed to give me the ball bearings. I claim the ball bearings were not delivered on time. The judge has to ascertain that the ball bearings were not delivered on time. Then beautiful common law principle, you calculate the liquidated damages, you impose that financial penalty upon the person that failed to perform. This is the basics of how common law contract enforcement works. In any successful market economy, you need these mechanisms of dispute resolution. What will that do? It will work at 2 levels. First is, when I fail on the foreign buyer, they hit me with financial penalties. They hit you with horrible financial penalties because all over the world, they are running an extremely tight production system. So I'll get some of my financial penalties reimbursed by inflicting financial penalties upon the various people that failed on me, which is fair and which defrays some of the costs. But part two, deterrence. Okay, if you know that contracts are going to be enforced, then every vendor in India will move heaven and hell and not be sloppy and not be relaxed and do whatever it takes. Okay, so there can be a band that is announced by a political party, but the firms have to get through to the right person and say, no, dude, my trucks have to go through. You do whatever it takes, my truck has to go through. Okay, that is the meaning of competence. That is the meaning of efficiency. To participate in the globalized world of manufacturing requires this level of perfection. It's not funny the level of quality and perfection that is required to actually do manufacturing. Many people denigrate manufacturing when they imply that it is some low skill, dumb problem which just involves large amount of unskilled labor. That's absolutely not true. To actually do manufacturing is a Herculean challenge because you're participating in global value chains with just-in-time delivery who are extremely demanding, who want perfect quality, perfect delivery on quantity, on date, and that's a high wire act. And because of the sloppiness of contract enforcement in India, we're just surrounded by incompetence and incompetence. Then burst his mighty heart, and muffling up his face, even at the base of Caesar's, even at the base of Pompey's statue, great Caesar fell. Okay, like ingratitude more strong than traitor's arms vanquished him. Yeah, no, I want to say incompetence more strong than traitor's arms vanquished him. That you're just surrounded by incompetence. You do contracts, the person can't be trusted, and deliveries don't come on time, then everybody tries to hold a lot of inventory to compensate, or you try to do business with family members or other trusted people, then you lose competitiveness, your costs go up. So this is the malaise, that to do manufacturing well is to achieve a cathedral of complexity where there's a rich array of contracts that surround the process of manufacturing, and everybody works to a tight ship with lethal financial consequences when you fail. And given the failures of dispute resolution in India, that doesn't happen in India, and that's not the case with services.
Instead of a cathedral of complexity, we have a hutment of failure. This is truly sad, and I love the language you use, like malaise, mores, so sophisticated. You know, this chapter is actually, it feels like such a masterclass because many gentle readers will often tell us through comments and elsewhere that, hey, this episode is really like a resource for me, and etc. etc. And this chapter is for me because whenever people ask me about manufacturing and services, I have one simple answer, which is broadly true, but now I can expand upon that with all of these points. And that simple answer is that that services, especially IT services, was relatively new for the Indian state. So it kind of got blindsided by it, and all the regulations and laws and etc. which were in place for manufacturing for decades were simply not there. And manufacturing, on the other hand, had to deal with that legacy of oppressive regulations and extractive behavior by the state, which was very hard to overcome. And that, in fact, is what the next chapter is going to be about.
Amit, I've begun by describing 8 areas where manufacturing is different from services, and it immediately makes you look back in history at the behavior of the Indian state and how the early machinery of the Indian state was just so inimical to Indian success. Take us through that historical narrative at the risk of a little bit of overlap with some other episodes.
Yeah, in episode 10, which is called Why Freedom Matters, we actually spoke about India's economic history in a sense. So I don't want to risk repeating too much of that, but I'll go through whatever is relevant to manufacturing itself, right? And let's start by talking about the colonial era. Let's start by talking before 1947 to understand how we got here. India accounted for about 20 to 25% of the world's manufacturing output in 1750. Right, we were doing damn well, and this was before the industrial age. All of it was artisanal output, but 20 to 25% is pretty awesome. Now, this became 2% by the year 1900. Now, there are two sort of narratives which talk about what colonialism did to us, and there's a certain amount of truth to both of them. One of those narratives is that colonialism was purely extractive and it destroyed India's, this manufacturing share of output and etc. etc. And again, in an earlier episode on tariffs, we have spoken about how early colonialism had a mercantilist output where people looked at the world in zero-sum ways, and you see some of that happening in the early colonial period for sure. And this criticism, which a lot of historians make, Dadabhai Naoroji famously made in the British Parliament, was essentially that you had machine-made, cheap textiles, especially cotton textiles from Manchester, being imported to India, and all our artisanal industries, weaving and etc., kind of getting destroyed by this. And therefore, we have that fall over a century and a half from 22% to 2%. So that is one part of the story where the British are completely the villains. A bunch of other historians, including someone we both admire a lot, Tirthankar Ray, paint a different picture. They say that it wasn't so bad, this is part of the story. But the main part of the story is that, look, the Industrial Revolution happened. Once you have machines coming into play, and once you have factories with machines and cheap labor and so on and so forth, then the artisans simply can't compete. And this was the truth elsewhere in the world, that the machine-spun fabric from England actually hurt handloom workers in other parts of the world as well, which were not colonized. So it's really a shift in technology, technological obsolescence, which is making this happen. And not so much just a case of colonialism. It just so happens that we got unlucky and industrialized a little later. At the same time, there was some industrialization happening. So by the 1850s, a certain Indian industrialization began to happen, some of it aided by British capital and indeed capital from elsewhere, as the world began to gradually kind of globalize. So you had, textile factories set up in Bombay and Ahmedabad, you had jute mills in Bengal, you had the Tata Iron and Steel Company set up in 1907, and so on and so forth. And you actually had a little bit of industrialization happening, especially in the first half of the 20th century, between 1913 to about 1947. And you had manufacturing's share of India's output grow from about 3.8% in 1913 to almost double to 7.5% at when independence was achieved. But out of a population of about 350 million people, only 2.5 million people were involved in manufacturing. So this is what manufacturing looks like in 1947 when India becomes independent. We've spoken about the Nehru years in many episodes. If you essentially look at the period between 1950 and 1965, Nehru's vision, which is partly inspired by what appeared then to be the Soviet model, and at that time, remember, the world didn't really know that the Soviet Union was a complete and utter failure. It was really a public relations success. So his model was one where the state would lead the heavy industrialization. You would have 5-year plans and so on and so forth. I have a great episode in Mahal on Abyss as well of the seen and the unseen, which kind of talks about that period in some detail. We've done episodes on it, both here and on the seen and the unseen. They'll all be linked from the show notes. And what happens during that period is that there is a deep distrust of private capital, and there are two fundamental mistakes that you can look back and say were made. One, of course, was import substitution, which was essentially you're cutting off India from world trade. Around 1947, India probably accounted for 2% of world trade. By 1990, that was 0.5%. It dipped drastically through all of these years because we just shut ourselves off and there was no export orientation. And if you just look around the rest of Asia at that point, export orientation made a huge difference. If you just look at Hong Kong, for example, Hong Kong went fully gung-ho towards an export-oriented economy. And in the 1960s, their income from exports was as much as India's income overall. South Korea boomed, Taiwan boomed, all of them because, they allowed for exports, they allowed for foreign capital to come in and so on and so forth. The second great mistake of that era was an aversion to the idea of competition. Mahalanobis in the mid-1950s famously said that competition is wasteful. Why should two companies make cars? One is enough, right? Little knowing that you get to good cars because different companies are competing. So the ideas, it seems so funny, but so many of our existing laws are based on this, Ajay Shah, that competition is wasteful. Why should 10 people make potato chips? Why should 5 people make laptops? एक ही company करेगी, और कौन सी company करेगी? State की company करेगी. So private enterprise was kept out, in some areas completely kept out. So the state is the only entrepreneur, and you had industrial licensing, whereas the state will determine every action taken by a private player. That you want to import this particular equipment, 18 months for you to get a license from us, so on and so forth. So this was what was happening in the Nehru era, and by 1965 it was already evident, frankly, that the model was failing. I find it hard to blame Nehru because he was a great statesman in other ways. He followed the fashion of the times. He was wrong about one fundamental thing, and perhaps had he lived, he would have corrected course. And we really didn't know at that time. People followed the myth of the Soviet Union and industrial planning. So in hindsight, it's very easy to look at these as mistakes. Then it wasn't. What happened after 1965, frankly, is unforgivable. We knew we were on the wrong track, and we deepened our journey into that wrong track. I often look at Indira Gandhi's economic policies, and I think of them as crimes on humanity. They were responsible for keeping hundreds of millions of people in poverty for decades longer than would otherwise have been the case. People look at Indira Gandhi and they look at the emergency and they say, oh, one fatal error, but had she not done that, she was fine, and etc., etc. And while acknowledging her strength as a leader in certain areas, like in the 1971 Bangladesh war, where, she proved to be a great leader and a great prime minister, but otherwise, I think of her as a moral monster. That she went in a particular leftward direction because it gave her a political edge over her opponents in the Congress party, and carried out a series of policies, which I shall soon detail out, which were disastrous for the Indian economy and especially for Indian manufacturing. So that by the end of the 70s, and there's a little bit of a revival which starts around that period, and 91 we really turn things around in a much better way. But by the end of the 70s, we were close to being a basket case, just 0.5% of world trade despite a high population. But let's get to the point of why Indian manufacturing suffered. It was because of the state. And I look at the 70s as a particularly tragic period because that is a decade we could have turned it around. We had the great advantage of cheap labor. We could have been a manufacturing superpower. The Southeast Asian countries got there before us. China got there around that time. Vietnam, Bangladesh got there a little later. We simply never got on that bus, and it's important to understand why. So let's list out some of the broad policy failures one by one. So first, let's start with industrial licensing. That started at the time of Nehru, and the idea was that any industrialist who wants to do something has to apply for permission to do it. And I will read out an example of this from Montek Singh Ahluwalia's excellent memoir, where he speaks about something that happened in the early 1980s. Narayan Murthy, the iconic co-founder of Infosys, told me of his personal experience in 1983 when Infosys wanted to import a Data General MV8000 computer with 3 removable disk drives with a capacity of 200 MB each. They had to make several trips to New Delhi to get the import license. By the time they got the license, a new disk drive with a capacity of 300 MB had become available, 30% cheaper. Naturally, they wanted to import the latest model. However, the original license specified the model number, and several additional visits to Delhi had to be made to modify the license. In an area where technology was changing rapidly and timely delivery of export orders was crucial, long delays in getting equipment was fatal for exporters. Now, similarly, in the time of Indira Gandhi, there was the MRTP Act, where, there was this ideological belief, which to my horror, some people still hold today, that large companies are not a good thing. And what the MRTP Act did was that it stopped companies from getting too big. So if you want to set up a new factory somewhere, you got to apply for permission. If you want to expand how much you are making of whatever product you make, you have to apply for permission. Everything is controlled by the state. And one point I often keep making is that there is nothing wrong with big companies. The point is, how do you become a successful venture? By giving people what they want, by making people better off, many, many double thank you moments. If there is a large company that is making a lot of profit, it simply means that it is serving society better at scale. What could be bad about this? And of course, we know the benefits of scaling, all the way down the line. And this wasn't allowed to happen. Then there were a bizarre set of regulations called small scale industry regulations, where basically there were certain areas like making garments or making shoes where the government decided that this should only be for artisans. So this should only be for small scale enterprises. You can't do it at scale. And the result is that you can't get too big if you are doing any of these things. You have to stay small. You can't be a conglomerate, you can't be a multinational, and of course, people aren't exporting at this point anyway, that's not open to us. You can't do all of those things. And what typically happens as you grow bigger, as you discover scale, as you specialize more and more, is that you get better and better. Your products get better, you deliver more value to consumers, and none of those things are happening because of regulations of this sort. Then there were foreign capital regulations, like Indira Gandhi famously brought in FERA, right, where it is criminal to bring in too much foreign exchange into the country. And the thing is, money is fungible. If I am running a business, like you said, cheap capital is so important. It should not matter where I get the capital from. I could get the capital from Surat, I could get the capital from Stockholm. It is nobody's business. There's money coming in for me to run my business here and to serve the people here. And where the money comes from simply doesn't matter. But by completely stopping the inflow of foreign capital, you are harming my capacity to grow. And all of these, by the way, fall in the area of the seen and the unseen, that great phrase by Bastia, which, I named my podcast after, because the unseen effect is simply so vast. Then there are a bunch of terrible labor laws, the Industrial Disputes Act being a particular one. And the Industrial Disputes Act was supposed to protect workers. And the idea was that if you are a factory with 100 workers or more, at any point in time, if you want to fire one of them, you have to take permission from the government. And this in practice became impossible. It became a way of rent seeking. And guess how people dealt with it? People dealt with it by simply not getting to 100 employees. So the Indian landscape was littered with companies that are 99 employees strong. In some cases 19, because there are different regulations which kicked in when you reached 20 employees, or even when you reached 10 employees. So you actually had little units of 9 employees, and if you want to expand beyond that, you set up another unit, which is a separate thing. So you have 9 people units, you have 19 people units, you have 99 people units. I believe the law was recently amended to make the number 300, but even that is ridiculous. If I am running a firm and I want to sack someone or I want to hire someone, to take permission from the state is absurd. The implication in that is that the state owns everything I own, that all property is owned by the state, that I am owned by the state, that I am a slave, that I have to take permission. And one of the key factoids that came up in the episode on MSMEs that you refer to, the Seen and the Unseen 419 with Naren and Sudhir, is the point that what does MSME stand for? Micro, small and medium. And India is mostly micro. There's very little small and medium. And of course, the small and the medium also is not allowed to scale and grow. But it's mostly micro. And why is it mostly micro? It's mostly micro because of stupid, idiotic laws like this. And this is not something that a lot of people understand, that the labor laws in India, which are ostensibly meant to protect workers, actually hurt workers the more. It's a classic example of why you should judge a policy not by its intention, but by its outcome. And I could go on and on. I could talk about price controls, price controls on various goods, freight equalization. The Inspector Raj is still active despite parts of the License Raj being dismantled. I think a common complaint that we have about the 91 reforms is that they didn't go far enough, especially when it comes to manufacturing. Factor markets were not reformed, labor, capital, land, etc., etc. But for a moment, this is a potted history. I don't want to go too deep into it because episode 10 has a lot of stuff. But I instead want to turn to you and say, okay, this is a potted history which tells us why things were dismal until 1990. What you have done in the first chapter here is shown us that, okay, things are a little better, but they are still not great. And my next question to you for the next chapter is, explain why. Like, what ails Indian manufacturing today? How many of these laws no longer exist? How many do?
Okay, Amit, I'm going to show 12 reasons why manufacturing in India does not work today. Okay, so just for clarity, gentle reader, earlier I gave you 8 ways in which manufacturing is different from services. So we need to appreciate that deep inside our head. Now we're going to go after what holds manufacturing in India back. Okay, reason 1 is labor law. So in your Seen and the Unseen episode, Sudhir and Naren make some very interesting points. They say at least in a good state like Maharashtra, the government has understood that wildcat trade unions and union bazi is really destructive for the economic growth of the state. So generally the government has started tamping down its support for unions and its willingness to go along with some of the provisions of Indian labor law. While they are right on that about Maharashtra, I will point out that there are many states in India that are not called Maharashtra, where all those concerns about labor unions are alive and well. And so the empowerment of trade unions by the Indian state, which by the way is called a market failure, called market power. When a bunch of workers come together, it's called market power and it's a market failure. And the job of the state should be to run interference against market failure, not to enable or enshrine it. The second part of the problem is minimum wage. I want to hold to you a great example, which is like a North Korea, South Korea comparison. Okay, so you have a communist country called West Bengal, where the minimum wage is 13,000 rupees, and you have a capitalist country called East Bengal, where I think the minimum wage is 8,000 rupees. Okay, and who do you think got an amazingly successful garment export industry? The answer is East Bengal. Okay, and what sense does that make? Like, why is the state better off by putting up a high minimum wage? Okay, the state should get out of the way. Then let people choose. Nobody is conscripting the workers. It's voluntary actions of workers that make them choose to work. Why should the state come into it saying 13,000 should be a minimum wage? And in fact, we get mass poverty in India because millions of people don't get those jobs and only a few capital intensive factories arise. The high minimum wage in India means the only way to make low tech problems like garmenting work in India is to amp up their technological complexity. You can't do it by hand because at that minimum wage, you're not viable on a global scale. So you get capital intensive garment manufacturing in India. What sense does that make? And the Indian financial system doesn't work too well. So capital is also quite expensive in India. Okay, and then you described Industrial Disputes Act and problems of closing factories, problems of sacking workers and all that. So all this is problem one, labor. The Indian state has created an environment that is not conducive for manufacturing.
And though we've spoken about it before, if someone hasn't seen that episode, they might say minimum wage is a good thing. You're guaranteeing people 13,000 bucks. What's wrong with that? And to that, I would say two things. You're not guaranteeing people 13,000 bucks. As is Milton Friedman explained in this video you see on the screen, and we'll have a link in the show notes. What simply happened is that you outlawed everyone whose labor is worth less than 13,000. It means they're out of a job. So it's not that if you were earning 8,000 and you have a minimum wage law that says 13,000, it's not that you suddenly earn 13,000. It's that you earn zero, a big fat zero. And also, you might say 8,000 is not a living wage, right? But the point is, someone who's taken a job worth 8,000, there are two things to note. Number one, he's taken the best option available to him. It is literally better than every other option. Every other option is worse. So how can you be condescending and say he should not be allowed to take that? And the other is that if there is a competitive marketplace, and it's a state's job to ensure that is a case by staying out of the way and enabling that and having rule of law, in a competitive marketplace, that 8,000 is a max that any company can pay. Otherwise, companies are also competing for labor. Some other company would then offer him more if there was an advantage in doing so. So what you really do is, with a minimum wage, you put the poorest people out of a job, which is just criminal and a classic example of how such laws hurt the people they're supposed to help.
One more way to see this is that imagine a voluntary transaction between consenting adults. There's a firm, there's a worker, and they're willing to work at 8,000, they're willing to work at 4,000. But no, now the state comes along, uses its monopoly of violence and says, I will not allow this to happen. And suddenly those two people are frustrated because they had wanted to do something together, but the government has interfered with that. It really is not a good idea.
So what's your next point, Ajay?
The next problem is infrastructure. Manufacturing involves moving goods around, and for many locations in India, in many parts of India, infrastructure remains a problem. Now, you and I did an episode of Everything is Everything titled Where Has All the Infrastructure Gone?, where we remark that giant gains have been obtained in Indian infrastructure and there was no commensurate improvement either in FDI into India or in manufacturing exports from India, or in manufacturing employment. So I'm not yet ready to say that this is a binding constraint today. I think the other 11 problems are more of a binding constraint. Currently, the infrastructure is a bit ahead, and we should not obsess that much on more infrastructure. Okay, the third story is around the land market. To some extent, I believe India is in the midst of a China-style land market bubble, where land values are just nuts. Land values are way beyond rental yields. Agricultural land prices are way beyond the plausible annual profit from doing agriculture. So land prices are nuts. Now, if you are a manufacturing company, what you want is a chunk of land, and you want road connectivity, you need electricity, you need water, you need safety. Okay, and that's a difficult package to put together. Most places in India would not be able to supply all these. Further, it actually doesn't end at the problem of just the land, because then you need the workers. So meaningfully, you need large factories. Okay, you get economies of scale. You will play on a global scale by the time a factory is well beyond 2000 workers. Anything below 2000 workers is really dinky on a global scale. It's non-trivial getting 2000 workers to show up every morning at one particular place. Then you need to think of the populations where all those people are living. For all your romantic notions of a village of 150 households is around 750 persons, out of which around 300 are available to work, out of which at most 100 would go to one particular factory. So if you have a factory near one village, you're getting 100, 200, 300 people from there. You're nowhere near 5,000, 10,000 workers from 5-10 surrounding villages. So this really needs an urban planning approach. You need urban density of the households who can then become workers in factories. So you should get out of the romantic idea that there will be factories near villages. Factories will always be near cities. And then you need urban density, you need the urban planning. Similarly, on the problem of shortage of land, yes, of course, you should be building high. Okay, so you need to increase the FSI so that factories are not limited to only being ground floor affairs. They should go up. There should be multiple floors of a factory. But then the moment you do that, you need the commensurate urban planning where there are roads. So for example, if you have a factory going up 5 floors, it requires 5x the logistics, it requires 5x the workers. Then you need the commensurate road and rail and other kinds of connectivity. Otherwise, once again, the whole thing breaks down. So what is needed is urban planning. Factories should be seen as an integral part of urban planning. So, Bimal Patel did this great talk at the Emerging Markets Conference, where he talked about his single unifying theme around urban planning, that the job of urban planning is to make sure like 40% of the land goes into streets and parks, and a mechanism through which some of that money comes back into the urban infrastructure. Okay, so industrial capabilities and manufacturing related land should be seen as integral to urban planning, not as Tata Steel going and buying some land at the back of beyond and then they are supposed to do all the urban development. That's not a reasonable description anymore. Okay, and then number 4, I come to the problem of labor. I already talked about one issue, that you want 2,000, 20,000, 100,000 workers in a factory. Where are they located? Where are they going to live? But then think not just entry level 8,000 rupees a month, 10,000 rupees a month blue collar labor. Think of the entire management tree. A factory is a very complex organization. It requires employees at many, many levels. Where are they going to live? Once again, you have to think urban. You can't have a remote factory far away, because then all the senior people will not be there. A factory has to be viewed as part of a city, and then in that context of the city, we will be able to get all the skill levels of the people who will work for a factory. And you just pause for one moment and you will see how this is an integrally urban problem. Imagine I'm going to put up a factory with 20,000 workers and we have 10,000 machines. So we've got an average of 4 humans per machine on the shop floor. Okay, 10,000 machines are on the shop floor. Well, 10,000 machines will have a repairs and maintenance schedule. They will have all kinds of care and feeding. There will be an operating system upgrade that has to be done on each of the machines. There will be many, many vendors and service providers who will do all that. Where will their employees sit? Okay, their employees need offices, their employees need homes, their kids need schools. Okay, these are high skilled people who are going to flash a prom on a CNC lathe. Okay, it doesn't come easily. So we should completely get out of this idea that a factory is going to sit somewhere in a village. Factories should be seen as deeply connected into the urban planning process, so that large density of a workforce going from low end all the way to high end and an array of associated service providers are all available in that urban semi-urban environment, who can then feed into these big complex factories. I know today in India, people are trying the Chinese dormitory model, where the factory will take responsibility for building hostels. Okay, I think that's deeply dissatisfying, and what we need is for Bimal Patel and Barjor Mehta and Suyash Rai to dream how to bring manufacturing into urban planning. Number 5, electricity. Okay, we already talked about the problem of electricity, the intermittency and the price point of electricity, and the inability of an exporter to demand and get 100% renewables, certifiable, auditable renewables. This is just an abysmal mess. Akshay Jaitley and I have been part of this field for many years. We are dreamers around a market-based electricity sector. We did a seen and the unseen episode with you about our coconut paper. You and I did an episode of Everything is Everything on the future of electricity.
One of our best episodes. Watch it.
And this is the stuff that needs to be done to make manufacturing work. Okay, number 6 is a very easy idea, trade barriers. Okay, it should be crystal clear to every Indian that when you put any friction at the border, then imported goods in India become more expensive. So the manufacturing company that is going to buy those imported goods ends up being less competitive. Okay, this is clear as daylight. If you want to be globally competitive, you need raw materials at global prices. Okay, so it is nuts that the most important yarn of the world is the yarn that goes into making artificial cloth, not cotton. Okay, and there is a 10% duty at the border, which drives up the price of all artificial fabric in India by 10%. Suddenly, the entire Indian garment industry is uncompetitive because cloth, their raw material in India, is 10% more expensive than that of Bangladesh and Vietnam and so on. This is just so basic that why do we do barriers at the border that are harming the ability of Indian firms to produce on a global scale? Gentle reader, Amit and I did 2 episodes back to back on globalization. Okay, there is a deep connection between all those issues and the question of manufacturing. Number 7, let me come to the problem of finance. Okay, so when I was describing how manufacturing is different from services, I said that you need a bigger amount of capital to buy land, build a factory, put machines into it, and you need more working capital. Okay, how do you solve all this? On the working capital problem, what we need is tough enforcement of the obligations of buyers. So if I buy ball bearings from you, I should be obliged to pay you as per contract. So the government should not specify that the payment should come in 3 days. Whatever is written in a voluntarily negotiated contract by you and me should be enforced with extreme harshness by a rule of law system. This is called a bankruptcy code. Okay, so if there is a contract and I gave you the ball bearings and you were obliged to pay me 10 crore rupees and that money is getting delayed, I should not have to do chakkar to your office and pay you Diwali gifts in the hope of getting paid. I should go take you to bankruptcy code that you have violated on a payment, and that should trigger a bankruptcy process. Unfortunately, in India, you and I discussed this in our bankruptcy episode. The political economy of bankruptcy reform made the big companies have a disproportionate influence, and they secured significant protections against the so-called operational creditors. Okay, operational creditors should be enshrined in bankruptcy law and given full power to demand getting paid on time. I think it's absolutely wrong as the design of a society that people don't get paid on time. So the answer is not a government portal where you'll put your invoice or whatever. The answer is bankruptcy code and the empowerment of operational creditors, and then the bankruptcy code will lead to the bankruptcy process for 10 important big companies of India. Great. After that, everybody else will get the message. Big companies can obtain cheaper capital than small companies. Why does it make sense for big companies to choke payments to small companies? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, and then you come to the main body of the capital. Manufacturing is capital intensive, it requires land, it requires machines, it requires a lot of capital to build. This is called financial sector reforms. Okay, so you and I have done an episode on the beauty of finance. More importantly, you and I have done an episode on the journey of Indian finance, which is the story of Indian financial reforms and some of the things that got done and many things that did not get done. And that paper, the journey of Indian finance, is available on the XKDR forum website. There is so much waiting to be done by way of financial reforms, and there's really no difficult political reason why this should not be done, and it would make a huge difference to manufacturing if the cost of capital comes down. Okay, number 8 is the problem of globalization. Global manufacturing is a truly global affair. You need people who will travel all around the world, who will do cross-border contracts, who will hold bank accounts in London and Vietnam, who will be truly global in their orientation. The entire Indian state is organized as an autarky. The Indian state mistrusts anything happening cross-border. When an income tax officer discovers that you have a bank account abroad, they start thinking, oh, you must be doing some hawala business. There are all kinds of laws, there are restrictions, and there is a fundamentally anti-globalization approach by the Indian state. That has to go away. Because to do manufacturing well, you have to be fully global. You have to be uncompromisingly global. Indian companies have to own operations all around the world, do contracts all around the world, do litigation and arbitration all over the world, fly around the world all the time. We have to solve simple frictions around passports and visas. So for example, I believe that in the UK, everybody is allowed to have 2 passports. Why? Because when I'm traveling on one, the other goes for a visa. Okay, it's such a simple rule. It's difficult for the Indian state to issue 2 passports to everybody so that you're not stuck. Otherwise, while I'm traveling, I have my passport on me and then I'm not able to get a visa for my next travels. So I'm forced to slow down the cadence of my travels because you have to spend some days in India to get the visas ahead of time. They're very simple fixes. You need a fundamentally pro-globalization orientation of the Indian state. We have to get out of our insecure, anti-Western, anti-foreign approaches, and we have to truly embrace the world that we are here, we are part of this world. Let's do everything in deep collaboration with the rest of this world. Okay, number 9 is the problem of size. Manufacturing is a scale game. Okay, you correctly said the learning that comes from experience. You and I did an episode on Moore's laws where we talked about Wright's law, that the curve that matters is on the x-axis, you put my lifetime output. What did I ever produce in my entire life? You put that up in log scale. And for each 10x gain, for each 2x gain in my lifetime output, I get a 20% gain in productivity. These are so-called experience curves that you need to do a lot of it. So you need very big factories where you're doing stuff on a giant scale. In a very big factory, if you have 10,000 machines, every subtle optimization is worth it. Because if you'll make a 0.1% efficiency gain on a per machine basis, it adds up to serious money. If you have a small factory, it's just not worth it. So small factories don't embed complex processes and complex optimizations. You need scale. And the entire Indian system is designed to trip up anything that becomes big. We in India today feel good about a 2,000-person factory. I just want to say on a global scale, that ain't much. You have to get to 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 workers. That is the nature of successful low-cost manufacturing in the world.
Some would dream of a factory with 1.7 billion people, Ajay Shah. Manufacturing national pride.
Okay, number 10, I talked about the cathedral of contracts. This requires improvements in the entire machinery of dispute resolution. There are some gains that have happened in the Bombay High Court and the Delhi High Court, led by the traditional judiciary. In my organization at XKDR Forum, we have been part of some beautiful gains in the working of district courts in Kerala. We'll put some links to this kind of work. I feel that this is the first time that we're getting serious process improvements on the working of the Indian judiciary. We need to do much more by way of arbitration, but we really need to get out of this concept that you can shamelessly renege on contracts and more or less get away scot-free. Our friend Shubho Roy, who is now a law academic at Shiv Nadar University, has long been campaigning on one issue. He says that the interest rates used by courts in awarding payments are absurdly low. Okay, so watch. I owe you 100 rupees. I failed to pay you 100 rupees. We waste 10 years in court. Okay. Now, if the court says 100 rupees with 5% interest has to be paid, that's a terrible deal because 5% is a very low number. Okay. So, the interest rates used by courts in their calculations need to be punitive, so that you will think 5 times before reneging upon somebody on a payment. So this whole dispute resolution infrastructure is a very critical thing that everybody needs to focus on and get right. Okay. Number 11 is tax policy. The GST is progress, but a fundamental principle of tax policy is you do not tax non-residents. If I'm exporting something, then the entire burden of indirect tax that has applied upon me must be refunded by the Indian state when the goods go out. Okay, so the Indian state has a footprint on taxing activities between you and me, but when you are sending goods abroad, you need a complete refund. In today's GST, and there's a thing called RODTEP. In today's GST and RODTEP, there is a partial refund of some things, and there are a lot of delays which generates a working capital requirement, and there are many things which are not being refunded. On the screen, I have put up a list of elements of Indian indirect taxation where the Indian manufacturing company suffers all these kinds of taxation and they do not get a refund. This is just not fair. This is not competitive because everywhere else in the world, the VAT is here and they get the complete refund at the point of export. The fundamental principle of taxation is you do not tax non-residents. Just like get out of that mentality that somebody sitting abroad is not your tax base. All you can do is tax your local activities here. Finally, number 12 is around labor. Okay, I again want to push back against the crude conception that manufacturing is some low skill activity. That is absolutely not true. To fully build a world-class exporting operation, yes, it does require hiring 10,000 people at 8,000 rupees, but it also involves hiring 1,000 people who are much more capable and 100 people who are super capable and 20 people who are global geniuses. Okay, that skill is not present in India today. For India to make the leap and become a manufacturing giant, we're going to need to hire people from abroad. So for example, a lot of amazing garment manufacturing talent is found in Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka is ahead of India on garmenting. Well, the Indian state needs to get out of the way on all the problems of immigration, work visa, all the misery that we put foreigners into. It should become easy and effortless for Indian companies to hire foreigners, because to do manufacturing is to be in a deeply global business and it's an extremely high skill problem. A lot of those capabilities are not found in India.
So Ajay, that was quite masterful, a lot for me to process. I will watch this episode again and again and again and maybe get our editor to do a version of it that doesn't have me and only you. But my next question is this, that is all of this a union government issue, or are some of these state government issues where states can actually compete with each other and get an advantage over each other by creating better laws, by enabling more freedom?
Absolutely critical for this reasoning. 5 out of the 12 are the work of the union government. Okay, look at the screen. We have put up 2 columns. The left column is 5 out of the 7 which are the work of the union government. 7 out of the 12 are the work of state governments. And so what you see in India is Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu have just run ahead compared to the rest of India in terms of the manufacturing capabilities, because on those 7 things they are faring better than the other states. And this is an active work program for every state government. Every state government needs to run an economic growth strategy where they need to go after the 7 things on the right, saying, yeah, one day the union government will do those 5 things on the left. That's a separate battle. Okay, we urge the union government to go after those 5 issues. But actually, each state is a master of its own destiny on 7 out of the 12 things. So there's a lot to be done. And in fact, there is a competitive environment in India where each state is competing with the others on trying to do these things better. So that is economic growth strategy at the level of each state. So Amit bhai, is all this fun? How should we think about it? And do you have any recommendations to offer?
All this is a lot of fun. I can't wait to record our next episode because I don't know what it has and I'll get to learn a lot from you. But my recommendation for this episode is going to be a site and a new venture called How Frameworks by our good friend Sudhir Sanobat. Absolutely brilliant man, self-made man, already a successful entrepreneur, has now set this up with his partner Rajendra Bagwe, who is a legend among entrepreneurs and industrialists in Maharashtra. And How Frameworks is a site that everyone who has a business of any sort should explore because it fundamentally gives you frameworks with which you can grow your business, turn your business around, take it to the next level. And it is not consultant talk, it is not bookish talk. It's come from a lifetime of experience in Indian conditions, in local conditions, taking into account all the things that we have spoken about in this episode. And even if you don't care about business, like I'm not running an active business, right? But I still found it really interesting and dived down a rabbit hole and spent a couple of hours, because if you're the kind of person who loves new ways of thinking about things, new frameworks of looking at the world, it has so much that is applicable to individuals and to how we live our lives and not just to businesses. So howframeworks.com, howframeworks.com. And to get a discount, please use the code Seen Unseen. I don't get a commission from this, but you gentle readers can get a discount with the code Seen Unseen. So How Frameworks, Sudhi Sanobat, you will hear a lot of that name later. Note it down, take a screenshot, and yeah, howframeworks.com.